Claire Mitchell thought she had married the perfect mankind, gentle and devoted. For 10 years, she believed her life was safe and ordinary, filled with quiet dinners and weekend routines. But one stormy night, a flicker of curiosity led her to a hidden door in their garage. What she found behind it shattered everything she knew about her husband. Inside that dark, secret room lay the proof that Greg Mitchell had been living a life far more twisted than she could ever imagine. Claire Mitchell had always believed her life was perfectly ordinary, and she liked it that way. Every morning began with the soft hiss of the coffee maker and the familiar creak of the kitchen floorboards as her husband, Greg, kissed her on the forehead before leaving for work. They lived in a neat, two-story home at the end of a quiet suburban street, surrounded by neighbors who waved from their driveways and children who rode bikes down the block. To anyone looking in, they were the image of stabilita, a couple that had found comfort in routine and each other. Claire often reminded herself how lucky she was to have a man like Greg. He was patient, calm, and attentive. He never raised his voice, never missed an anniversary, and always knew how to make her laugh after a long day. But as perfect as everything seemed, little things sometimes didn't make sense. Greg had developed a habit of spending long hours in the garage, claiming he was fixing old tools or organizing his workbench. Claire rarely questioned it at first. After all, everyone needed their own space. Yet she began to notice patterns. He'd disappear right after dinner and return only after midnight. When she joined him once, he quickly shut the door, smiling as he told her it was just a mess and he didn't want her to trip over things. She laughed it off, pretending not to feel the small sting of curiosity. Over time, Greg became slightly distant, though not in a way Claire could exactly describe. He still brought her flowers on Fridays and texted her every morning, but his eyes seemed tired, as if burdened by thoughts he wouldn't share. His phone, which once sat openly on the counter, was now locked with a passcode she didn't know. When it buzzed, he'd grab it instantly. Claire noticed, but she said nothing. She told herself that after 10 years of marriage, trust meant giving space, not asking questions. Then came the night of their 10th anniversary. They had planned a quiet dinner at home. Claire cooked his favorite meal, roast chicken and mashed potatoes, and even opened a bottle of wine they'd been saving since their wedding. Greg seemed distracted, checking his phone repeatedly. Halfway through dinner, it rang. He glanced at the screen, went pale, and muttered something about a work emergency. Before she could say anything, he grabbed his coat and keys and rushed out the door. Claire sat alone at the table for nearly an hour, staring at the untouched food. The house felt unusually quiet. Every sound amplified the ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of the overhead light. When Greg finally returned the next morning, he looked disheveled. Apologisate, saying there had been a crisis at work, but his explanation was vague. She wanted to believe him, but something in her gut told her he wasn't telling the whole truth. Days passed, and life seemed to return to normal, but Claire couldn't shake the unease. She found herself paying attention to the smallest details: the smell of oil on his clothes, the way he locked the garage before bed, the faint thud she sometimes heard at night coming from outside. Once, she thought she saw a light flicker in the garage window long after Greg had gone to sleep. When she mentioned it the next morning, he brushed it off as a reflection from a passing car. Still, doubt began to take root. She wondered if maybe Greg was having an affair. The thought made her chest tighten, not out of anger, but fear. She didn't want to believe the man she had built her life around could betray her. Yet the more she tried to ignore it, the more the signs seemed to multiply. One afternoon, while folding laundry, she noticed dirt on one of Greg's shirts, not the usual dust from the garage, but thick, dark soil. She asked about it that evening, and he told her he had to help a coworker fix a flat tire near a construction site. It sounded reasonable enough, but his tone was off to rehearsed. Too quick. That night, Claire lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. She tried to remind herself of all the good years they had shared, of the laughter and warmth and love. But beneath that comfort, Something darker pulsed a quiet suspicion she couldn't name. It wasn't just another late-night hobby or secret phone call. Something inside her whispered that Greg was hiding far more than she could imagine, and that whatever it wasn't just about another woman. It was something sick, something she wasn't meant to find. The storm rolled in quickly that evening, dark clouds swallowing the last bit of light as heavy rain began to pound against the windows. Claire sat alone in the living room, trying to read, but the flickering lamps made the words blur. When the power went out, the house fell silent except for the wind howling outside. She reached for a flashlight and decided to check the fuse box in the garage. Greg was out of town for work again, leaving her to manage things alone. As she made her way through the dim hallway, her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, each creak sounding louder than usual in the darkness. The garage smelled faintly of oil and metal. Claire swept the beam of the flashlight across the room until it landed on the fuse box. But as she passed the back wall, something caught her eye. The wall looked different. The paint was cleaner, the wood slightly newer than the rest. At first, she thought maybe Greg had repaired it recently, but then she noticed a tarp hanging awkwardly in front of one section, like it was hiding something. The tarp's edges fluttered from the draft as if inviting her to look behind it. Curiosity battled with hesitation. Greg had always been protective of his workspace, insisting it was just tools and junk. But now that she was alone, the secrecy felt strange. Slowly, she pulled the tarp aside, revealing a small, uneven door she had never noticed before. It wasn't a typical door, just a thin wooden panel with a simple latch. Her heart began to race as she lifted it open. The hinges groaned, and a wave of cold, stale air drifted out. Inside was a narrow room, no bigger than a closet, lit only by the dim flashlight in her trembling hand. The air was thick and musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. She took a cautious step inside and immediately noticed the shelves. They were lined with boxers, notebooks, and old electronic devices. Everything was neatly labeled and organized, far too precise to be random storage. The floor was covered with plastic bins, filled with papers and photographs. Claire picked up one of the notebooks. The pages were covered in Greg's handwriting, but what she read made her skin crawl. Each page listed names, dates, and strange notes. Spotted near park, watched from 6 o'clock to 6:45. Approached once, no contact. She turned another page and found a photo stapled to a woman standing near a coffee shop. Unaware she was being photographed, beneath it, Greg had written, "Still missing." Claire's breath hitched. She dropped the notebook, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She opened another box, desperate to prove to herself that it was a misunderstanding. But inside were more photos, dozens of Tim. Some looked old, others recent. All were of strangers, their faces frozen in everyday moments. Walking dogs, shopping, jogging. None of them looked posed, as if taken from a distance, without their knowledge. Some photos had red markings, circling their faces. Others had notes, like "found" or "no trace." A wave of nausea swept over her. Greg wasn't just collecting random things. He was watching people, trekking team, documenting their lives in terrifying detail. The realization sent a chill through her entire body. She backed out of the small room, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, the beam landed on something else, a small metal box tucked beneath the lowest shelf. Against her better judgment, she crouched and opened it. Inside were trinkets, necklaces, watches, earrings, each tagged with a name and a date. They weren't just random items. They looked like personal belongings, souvenirs, taken from real people. Claire stumbled back, dropping the box. A metallic clink echoed through the garage, sounding far too loud in the silence. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting the urge to scream. The perfect husband she had loved for a decade had a secret life buried right under their roof, hidden behind a wall she was never meant to open. Her flashlight dimmed again, casting the room into near darkness. She turned and fled, slamming the small door shut behind her and backing away as though it might open on its own. Her pulse thundered, her breath short and shallow. She didn't know what the names meant or what had happened to the people in those photos, but every instinct screamed that she wasn't safe. As lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the garage for a split second, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. A fresh set of muddy footprints on the floor. They weren't hers, and they were leading away from the hidden door. Claire barely slept that night. The image of those photographs and the eerie notes written in Greg's careful handwriting replayed in her mind over and over. By morning, her hands still trembled as she made coffee she couldn't drink. Every sound in the house felt louder, sharper: the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the hallway floor, the ticking of the wall clock. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting Greg to walk in, even though he wasn't due home for 2 more days. The footprints she had seen in the garage haunted her most. She wasn't sure if they were old or recent, but the thought that someone else might have been there made her skin crawl. Eventually, she gathered the courage to go back into the garage in daylight. The rain had stopped, and the morning light streamed through the window, softening the edges of what she had found. It looked almost ordinary now, as if her imagination had exaggerated it all. But when she opened the hidden door again and saw the notebooks exactly where she had left them, she knew it was real. She snapped photos with her phone, every page, every name, every photo she could capture. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to continue until she had enough evidence to show someone who could help. The drive to the police station felt endless. Her heart pounded the entire time, and she kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half convinced she was being followed. When she finally arrived, she walked straight to the front desk and asked to speak with an officer. Her voice was unsteady as she explained what she had found in her husband's garage. She showed them the pictures on her phone and handed over one of the notebooks she had taken with her. The officer looked skeptical at first, flipping through the pages slowly, but as he turned to the sections with photographs and detailed notes about missing people, his expression changed. He asked her to wait while he called for a detective. Claire sat in the small, sterile waiting area, the sound of her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Part of her wanted to run away and pretend she had never seen any of it, but deep down, she knew she couldn't. Hours passed as detectives questioned her. They asked how long she had known about the notebooks, when Greg traveled, and whether he had ever shown violent behavior. She answered everything honestly, though each question made her feel smaller, more foolish. How could she have lived beside a man capable of something so dark and never noticed? They told her they would investigate immediately, but warned her not to confront him. That evening, police cars surrounded her house. Claire watched from her car as officers moved in and out of the garage, carrying boxers and bags of evidence. One of them emerged, holding the same small metal box she had found, the one filled with jewelry and personal items. The sight made her stomach twist. What had Greg done to those people? Where had he gone at night when he said he was working late? The next day, Greg was arrested at his office. Claire heard about it from a detective who called to inform her. They had enough evidence to charge him with stalking, breaking and entering, and obstruction of justice. But the investigation was far from over. Forensics teams continued to search their property for days, uncovering more evidence that suggested Greg had been following missing individuals for years. News crews soon arrived, filling the quiet neighborhood with flashing cameras and whispered speculation. Reporters called him the Collector, a man who built a secret archive of strangers' lives. Claire watched the coverage from a hotel room, too afraid to return home. The man smiling in her wedding photos was now being called a predator, a manipulator, a danger. She sat in silence, replaying every moment of their life together, trying to spot the clues she had missed. The nights he came home late, the strange smell on his clothes, the hidden phone she once brushed off as work-related, all of it made sense now. The realization was devastating. The person she had trusted most wasn't who he seemed at all. He had lived a double life right beside her, in the same house, under the same roof, pretending to love her while hiding something sick enough to destroy everything. For the first time in 10 years, Claire felt like she didn't know who she was anymore. Her marriage, her memories, her sense of safety, everything had been built on lies. As she stared out the window at the gray sky above the city, she realized that Greg's secret had not only shattered their life together, it had changed her forever. The weeks after Greg's arrest passed in a blur of headlines, police interviews, and sleepless nights. Claire moved out of their house temporarily, staying in a small apartment downtown while investigators continued to search the property. The life she once knew had completely unraveled. Every morning, her phone buzzed with reporters asking for comments, neighbors sending messages of shock and pity, and strangers online discussing her husband's crimes like they were a TV show. She avoided the news as much as she could, but it was impossible to escape. Everywhere she looked, there were photos of Greg's face, the man she had once trusted with her whole heart, now branded a monster. Detectives eventually called her back to the station. They wanted to go over what they had found. Claire sat in a cold, gray room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as they explained the truth. Greg had been leading a double life for nearly 7 years. He had created fake online identities to track random people, often following them in real life after studying their routines. He would photograph them without their knowledge, collect items that belonged to them, and keep detailed records of where they went. Some of his victims had been reported missing, though police could not yet connect him to their disappearances. He told investigators that he was conducting psychological studies, claiming he was fascinated by human behavior. But the level of obsession in his notes suggested something far darker. Claire listened in silence, her stomach churning as every new piece of information sank in. Greg had gone to great lengths to keep his secrets hidden. He'd used full storage units, prepaid phones, and encrypted files on his laptop. He'd even attended a true crime conference the year before, posing as an independent researcher. The detectives believed he might have been planning to escalate his actions to go beyond watching and collecting. In one of his notebooks, they had found a section labeled Next Phase. It contained sketches of isolated locations, handwritten lists of supplies, and chilling notes about testing fear responses. The officers assured her that Greg had not confessed to any violence, but their tone carried an unspoken warning. They thought it was only a matter of time before he acted on his fantasies. The thought made Claire's skin crawl. She tried to reconcile this version of her husband with the man who once kissed her forehead each morning, who fixed her car when it broke down, who held her when her father died. None of it made sense anymore. After leaving the station, she sat in her car for nearly an hour, staring blankly at the steering wheel. She felt hollow, as if the world she knew had been stripped away piece by piece until nothing remained. Even her own memories felt untrustworthy now. How many of those quiet nights together had been real, and how many had been part of his act? The following days brought even more disturbing discoveries. Investigators found hidden cameras and small objects around the house, a smoke detector in the hallway, a clock in the bedroom, even a pen on her desk. They revealed that Greg had been recording for years. Some footage showed her doing mundane things, reading, cooking, sleeping. He had documented her life the same way he had with strangers. She wasn't just his wife, she had been another one of his subjects. When she learned that, something inside her broke. The fear she had felt turned into anger, then grief. Every moment of intimacy, every word of affection, had been tainted by his twisted curiosity. She wondered if he had ever loved her at all, or if she had simply been part of his experiment. The police asked if she wanted to testify during the hearings, but Claire wasn't sure. The thought of facing him again made her chest tighten. She imagined his calm expression, the same one he'd worn when lying so effortlessly to her, and she wasn't sure she could stand it. Still, she knew the evidence she provided might help the investigation. She agreed to cooperate, even though every time she saw his handwriting or his face on a file, it felt like reopening a wound that refused to heal. By the time the court hearings began, the town had already made up its mind. Greg Mitchell was the predator hiding in plain sight, the respectable husband who turned out to be a danger no one saw coming. And Claire, once admired for her perfect marriage, was now the woman who had unknowingly lived beside evil. She attended the first hearing quietly, sitting in the back as Greg was led and handcuffed. He didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead, emotionless. For the first time, Claire realized that maybe he never really had a soul to look for. That night, as she walked out of the courthouse into the fading light, she felt both terrified and strangely free. The truth had destroyed her world, but at least now she saw it clearly. The mask was gone, and so was the illusion of safety. Months passed, but the nightmare refused to end. Even after Greg's arrest and the endless court hearings, Claire couldn't escape the shadow of what he had done. Reporters had moved on to newer stories, but whispers still followed her everywhere. At the grocery store, people looked twice. At the library, conversations went quiet when she entered. To them, she wasn't just Claire Mitchell anymore. She was the wife who hadn't known, the woman who had slept beside a man capable of something sick and terrifying. She spent her days trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy. She attended therapy sessions, volunteered at the shelter, and forced herself to leave the apartment at least once a day. But at night, sleep was almost impossible. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump. Every sound outside reminded her of the secret room, the notebooks, and the faces of those strangers Greg had tracked. Sometimes she dreamed of him standing at the foot of her bed, silent, his expression unreadable. She always woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. When Greg's trial finally began, Claire was called to testify. The courtroom was cold and sterile, filled with curious onlookers and flashing cameras. Greg sat across the room in his orange prison uniform, his once confident posture replaced by a quiet stillness. He barely looked at her as she described finding the hidden room, the notebooks, and the photos. She spoke carefully, her voice shaking only once, when she mentioned the jewelry box filled with names and dates. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, not guilt, not sadness, but a faint satisfaction, as if he was pleased that his secret had left such a mark on her. The prosecution revealed evidence Claire hadn't known about. Greg had recorded videos of his subjects, often breaking into their homes just to rearrange objects or leave subtle signs of his presence. The videos showed people waking up, confused, sensing something was wrong but never realizing someone had been there. It was a twisted game to hypnotize of control. The court watched in silence, the room heavy with disgust. Claire could barely look at the screen. Every time she did, she saw the reflection of the man she thought she knew, holding a camera with unnerving calm. After weeks of testimony, Greg was convicted on multiple charges, including stalking, breaking and entering, and unlawful surveillance. The judge called his actions a sustained campaign of psychological terror. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Greg was led away in chains. Claire felt no triumph, only emptiness. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring peace. Determined to move forward, she returned to their house one final time to collect her remaining belongings. The place was eerily quiet, stripped of furniture and life. Dust coated the windowsills, and the air smelled stale. As she walked through each room, memories pressed against her, the laughter they shared, the dinners they cooked, the promises they made. None of it felt real anymore. When she reached the garage, she hesitated. The hidden room was still there, sealed off by police tape. But curiosity pulled her closer. In the corner, half buried under a pile of old boxers, she noticed something the investigators had missed: a plain cardboard box, labeled memories. At first, she thought it was filled with old photographs of them, but beneath the wedding pictures and postcards was a false bottom. Her heart began to race as she lifted it. Inside was a small flash drive. She took it to her apartment and hesitated for hours before plugging it into her laptop. The files were labeled with dates and numbers. When she opened the first one, her screen filled with grainy footage videos of people in their homes, unaware they were being watched. Claire scrolled through dozens of files, each one showing different victims. Then she found a folder labeled C. Her hand froze. Inside were videos of her sleeping, cooking, reading. Every private moment she had thought was hers alone. He had been documenting her for years, just as he had with strangers. Tears blurred her vision as she slammed the laptop shut. She realized that Greg's obsession wasn't just about control over others, it had extended to her, the person he claimed to love most. She had never been his partner. She had been his project. That night, Claire packed her things and left the city. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She drove until the skyline disappeared behind her, until she found herself on an empty country road surrounded by silence. She stopped the car, stepped out, and watched the sunrise paint the sky in soft shades of gold. For the first time in months, she felt the faint stir of peace. The past couldn't be erased, and Greg's secret would haunt her forever. But at least now she was free from him, from the house, from Tafir, from the illusion of a perfect marriage that had never really existed. The man she had loved was gone, but so was the woman who once believed she knew him. What remained was someone stronger, scarred but awake to the truth. That evil doesn't always come in the form of a stranger. Sometimes it wears a wedding ring and calls you my love.